Hello, and welcome to our latest episode of Trade Talks, a regular series on key issues surrounding global trade. I'm Tom O'Brien with the Center for International Trade and Transportation at California State University, Long Beach, and I'm pleased to have as our guest today Dr. Genevieve Giuliano, who is a professor and the Margaret and John Ferraro Chair in Effective Local Government at the Saul Price School of Public Policy at USC. That's the University of Southern California. She's also the director of the MetTrans Transportation Center. And our focus for this episode is the current state of our trade and transportation systems. We want to talk about the conditions of our infrastructure, the way we finance that infrastructure, and what it means for the trade sector, of course. And if we have some time at the end, we'll be taking a look into our crystal ball into the future of trade systems. Jen, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I think people understand generally transportation, or at least what they see. You teach transportation, you research transportation. Tell us a little bit about what that entails.
Well, first of all, I like to tell my students that they will never run out of a job, because transportation will always have problems and we'll be the ones to figure out how to solve them. Secondly, transportation is absolutely essential to everybody's life. If you live in a city, you could not survive without transportation, and we would not have cities as we know them without effective transportation systems, both for people and for moving goods around. So it's hard to think of a more important topic to teach at the graduate and undergraduate levels.
Yeah, and I mentioned in the beginning that you have a secondary role as the director of the Metrans Transportation Center. And full disclosure, we've worked together at that center for
a really long
time. But it's important to mention because this is a big year for MetTrans, and why is that the case?
Yes, it is. We are celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. The MetTrans Center was founded way back in 1998 as a partnership between Cal State and USC. And I was actually one of the people that was working on doing that at the time. And from that little success that we had in 1998, we are now a very large center with partners literally all over the world.
Which reflects, I think, sort of the changing nature of transportation. Trade is global.
Absolutely.
Right? Partnerships are global. What changes have you observed in that 20-year period when it comes to the way we think about transportation, the impact of technology?
First of all, there's been a big shift in attention to the environment and the environmental impacts of transportation. We are now, of course, in California, trying to get control of greenhouse gas emissions, and the transport sector is a large part of that. For a long time, we have been learning more and more about the pollution effects of transportation, in particular particulate matter. So this has actually changed public policy regarding transportation in really big ways in the past years. The second big trend is technology, and particularly information technology, which has had tremendous impact even on the structure of transportation industries.
And what about changes in the way we move people and goods over that time?
Well, on the people side, you know, it's in a way it's kind of a boring story. And that's because we have been at the urban level using the same strategies for a very long time. And those strategies have been to try to get people out of their cars and use public transportation, use non-motorized modes. And that's been going on since the 1960s, actually. And we have more use of the private automobile now than we ever did before. So the toolbox on the passenger side actually is not working all that well. On the goods movement side, the big shifts have been in the globalization of industry and therefore the globalization of trade and manufacturing and production. And that has led to a huge increase in overall flows around the world, which has kind of generated all these secondary effects in terms of concentration, economies of scale, and all sorts of things.
And since the people and the goods sometimes share that infrastructure,
oh, yes.
I think it's worth taking a moment to talk a little bit about how we finance our infrastructure, how it gets developed, because I think in many ways that's invisible to the people who use the system. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's invisible until the pothole
Right.
blows your tire, and then you get more interested in what's going on. But we fund transportation in very complex ways. So I'm going to start with the federal highway system. And that is primarily financed through user fees, the gas tax, fuel taxes, excise taxes. And of course, that source of money has become less productive over time for a number of reasons. But that's the main source
Does that
for
include the fuel efficiency of our vehicles?
it includes the fuel efficiency of our vehicles. It includes the rising costs of construction, because we're doing a per gallonage tax, which is not sensitive to inflation. So the dollars that are being brought in are cheaper dollars all the time. And it is also in part the fact that we have expanded the program to include urban transportation, and in particularly public transit. So we don't have enough money to do what we need to do. And the impact, of course, is the potholes in the roads that you see. Goods movement is a totally different scheme, as is air transport. Air transport basically pays for itself through a variety of user fees. Roughly 98% of all of the air transport system is paid for by user fees. On the highway side, it's about 75%. On the port side, it depends on where you are, because states have so much control over ports and port infrastructure. So many states actually subsidize their ports as an economic development strategy or regional development strategy, and many states do not. California is one that does not subsidize its ports.
You're right, it's a very complex environment, but fascinating. And I wonder too about that highway side, which has less resources available to it. I know that there's been discussion about sort of changing the way the gas tax contributes to sort of the financing at the federal level, but that's a tough political sell.
It is a very tough political sell. There's a lot of talk, for example, of going to a mileage-based fee, because as we move towards zero-emission vehicles, we're not going to be buying nearly as much gasoline or diesel. So the gas tax eventually will kind of disappear. In the
not too distant future.
In the not too distant future, within maybe 20 years, we'll start moving towards that.
Okay.
So we don't have the next alternative. However, mileage-based fees or tolls on the entire system or things like that are actually much more difficult to do than you would think. It's not only a tough political sell, but it's actually a tough implementation problem, because the gas tax actually funnels very simply, because we are taxing, actually the tax is paid by the fuel producers. So there's kind of a finite number of fuel producers in the United States. There's 350 million people in the United States and about 200 million cars, right? So you would actually have to have a system that would be able to individually charge each and every one of those cars. So it's actually, the implementation problems have not been solved either.
Does technology help us get closer to that?
Technology always helps us get closer, but at the same time, again, even if everything is in a gigantic database, we still have the problems of handling that database and protecting it and figuring out how states are going to share the money and so on and so forth. It's really a big deal.
So we have a national system and then 50 different state
Yes, we
systems.
do. Remember, the highway system belongs to the states.
Okay, right. And is this a common approach globally, or once again are we unique in North America?
If you want some different examples, go to Europe. Europe has a variety of user fees on transportation, specifically on cars in the highway system and on trucks in the road system. Those fees go into general revenue. They are not earmarked for transportation at all. So it's just the reverse system of what we have in the United States. And they spend a lot more as a percent of GDP on public transportation. So we spend roughly 2% of GDP on public transport. They spend between 5 and 7.
That's a significant difference.
Yes.
Right, and who owns that right of way and the capacity and what it's principally used for?
It's all in the public sector, with the exception of Britain. Britain has privatized its rail system, for example, but most of it is in the public realm.
I think the other thing that's an interesting story as an observer of the transportation system is sort of the rise of personalized mobility.
Yes.
And transit. And is this a global phenomenon as well, or is this a largely U.S. phenomenon?
You can take the equivalent of Uber in China, in Beijing, for example. You can take it in many countries of Europe. You can do it in South America. But it's regulated in very different ways depending on where you are. So in China, in Beijing, Uber has to fulfill all the same requirements of a taxi company. And so essentially it costs the same as a taxi ride because it has to do all those things. So it does not really have a comparative advantage. Singapore operates exactly the same way. We, on the other hand, in California, are struggling with trying to impose some of the basic requirements that we impose on the taxi system on TNCs, transportation network companies.
Okay. That's what they're called now.
Yes,
TNCs.
TNCs.
And there are differences, though, state by state, even in that regard, too. So
Yes,
it's hard to.
Exactly, because we're a federal country, and that means the states have purview over everything that the federal government doesn't specifically have purview over.
You mentioned California, and we talked about the fact that the financing piece is challenging. Are states and cities trying to fill that gap and respond so that they can meet localized needs?
States and cities have responded. 30 states have increased their own gas tax in the past 5 years because they know somebody has to be able to take care of the infrastructure that's already there. And many of these states, by the way, are Republican states. It's not just Democratic states that have raised the fuel tax or the state gas tax. And many locals in the big urbanized areas. So the New Yorks, the Chicagos, the LAs, the San Franciscos, those kinds of big urban agglomerations also provide a great deal of local money as part of the investment.
And that goes toward transit as well as roadways?
Yes. In the case of Los Angeles, of course, the vast majority of local money is going to public transport, not to roads at all.
And is this the trend moving forward, do you see?
You're asking a question for which I have a subjective opinion rather than an objective
That's valid.
opinion.
We'll take that.
And my subjective opinion is that we really need a national transportation system. We need it for interstate commerce, we need it for connectivity, we need it for people to see their relatives and their friends, we need it for all kinds of reasons. And if we continue to go down this road of devolution, where the federal role keeps shrinking and shrinking, and the states become and the locals become stronger and stronger, the feds are going to be in a position of not being able to impose any kind of standardization or anything else because they have no financial clout. We're about to embark on automated vehicles. We are about to embark on tolls. We don't have standards. We don't have national standards for any of that stuff. And if the federal role continues to shrink, that's going to be a bigger and bigger problem. And the benefits of investing in automation are going to be smaller if this is going to happen at an individual state level.
Well, and we're seeing that even with big projects like HighSpeed Rail, which you think would sort of have a national stamp on it, are being addressed state by state or at least region by region.
Yes,
is that the case?
That's absolutely true. The Northeast Corridor has a Northeast Corridor Authority. I don't remember its exact name, but it's a consortium of all the states in the Northeast Corridor, which runs from basically Boston to Washington, D.C. And they are together working on a plan to improve and eventually get to real high-speed rail in that corridor. Chicago and a couple of states in that area are doing kind of the same thing. Texas has a high-speed rail plan, and of course California has its own high-speed rail plan. All of them started out expecting very large subsidies from the federal government. Those have not been forthcoming, so none of these projects are in a particularly healthy state at this point.
And I imagine that as consumers of the transport system, we've become a lot more particular about what that looks like because we can control so much of it from our phone. We can order food that's delivered to us, right? We can order a trip on an Uber or a Lyft. We can access the information on the transit systems. How challenging is that for developing a transportation system where you have so much input now from the end user?
In theory, it should be better rather than worse because the user is the customer. And if we know more about user preferences, we ought to be able to provide better service. So I think it's a good thing rather than a bad thing. And I think the expectations for having full information, for example, as a transit rider, that should be a minimum in terms of transit service quality rather than something that's considered exceptional.
We're gonna shift in a moment to sort of a discussion about trade infrastructure and systems in particular. But I'm just curious if you were to look ahead 20 years into the future of public transit, what highways look like. What do you think we'll be experiencing as users of the system?
Okay. Giuliano's view of the world is that we're in for a very long period of transition. So as much as you're hearing about Uber and Waymo and all these new companies.
You may want to mention Waymo because I'm not sure if everybody.
Oh, I'm sorry. Waymo is I think it's Google's arm for developing automated vehicles. And all of these automated vehicles that are being developed in this way are individual vehicles that depend on an array of sensors and reading the environment to be able to operate, okay? They are not getting information from the infrastructure. And so if that's the path that we take, it will be a very long time before there's a significant number of those in the fleet. Meanwhile, we have to figure out how those operate in a mixed fleet. And there's all kinds of issues there. So my guess is that the next 20 years is transition, and it really won't be until after 20 years that we start to see enough numbers of automated vehicles to actually change the way the system operates itself.
And I assume that's overcoming obstacles of not only the technology that you mentioned, but also the financing and funding, as well as the political opposition to these types of A new world of
Yeah,
autonomous
there's
vehicles.
the political opposition. There's also the issue of which path are we going to go down? The Waymo or the Uber path, as I said, is individual autonomous vehicles that are operating on their own. The other alternative is autonomous vehicles that are part of a system and are being controlled by, let's call it a system operator. Okay, that's what you need if you really want the economies, the short headways and all the things that we dream about, the truck platoons. Truck platoons can only go so far if they're operating on their own without the management to prevent cars from getting in front of them and things like that. So a lot of it depends on whether we're going to see substantial investment on the public side to create the infrastructure that we need to do this.
And in the vacuum of public leadership,
That's right.
is it the private operators that fill? Is it Google that will be designing
Google
our
is
future
never
systems?
going to pay for the infrastructure, and the private sector is not going to pay for it. There's a lot of ideas about. We take the model of Google or Facebook, right? Which gives us all these great services for free because they're buying our data, right? And so why wouldn't they invest in infrastructure so that they could buy our infrastructure data? Well, they're already buying it through our cell phones. So it's not clear that there's enough value added that would bring them to the table to actually invest real money.
Interesting. Do you see a public transit system still existing
Yes.
in the future in the last 20 years?
I do, but it's a trunk line system.
Explain what that means.
It means that the public transit is going to operate in the highest demand corridors. So subways are not going to disappear. Rail lines that are used heavily are not going to disappear. Rapid bus lines that are used heavily are not going to disappear. But the last mile network is going to disappear. And it's going to be replaced by something like Uber, something like an on-call system, probably ride-shared. But it's going to be, I think, in that mode rather than in buses on conventional routes that come every 20 or 30 minutes.
And that last mile is something that we're going to be talking about when it comes to the freight sector as well. Before we close this segment, though, you talked a little bit about sort of the market for air transport and maritime transport as well. Do you see significant changes in demand for passenger services? Is it going to be priced differently? You mentioned that it's a significant portion now, the majority is covered by user fees. Any changes in that area?
I think we're going to see more user fees one way or another, probably in pockets where there's a lot of congestion, as we're kind of seeing now. I think it'll be a while before we get to mileage-based fees. It might be more realistic to think about pricing the freeway system. Somehow little tolls that every time you go on the on-ramp, you get charged something. I think that's probably more realistic than your personal mileage being tracked for any number of reasons. So I do see that happening. As long as population grows, demand's going to grow. In this country, we are saturated with the automobile pretty much. So it's actually in the rest of the world where we're going to see the big increases in personal mobility. So it's China, it's India, it's all of the Southeast Asian developing countries, and 10, 20 years from now, it'll be Africa.
And you mentioned sort of looking at population and demographics, and I assume that there's a significant set of challenges that comes with an aging population and what that means for transportation as well, particularly in cities.
Yes. Mobility for the elderly, well, for everybody, is really important. We've done studies to see what happens to people when they do not have mobility. That's related to depression, illnesses, shorter lifespans, all kinds of things as a result of the isolation that a lack of mobility generates. So it is a very big problem. To some extent, this is where semi-automation makes a lot of sense, because if you have a kind of semi-intelligent car, it takes the burden off of the driver. So I can very much imagine my generation being more than happy to have somebody else make sure I don't run over someone, with automated braking and things like that. So I think some of that will help. Also, we're either going to have to kind of stand up as a society and provide that mobility, even though it's very expensive, or we're going to have to live with the consequences of not doing it.
And we haven't even talked about sort of the conflicts between these uses within a city, or the need to provide adequate pedestrian and bike serving facilities or pathways that avoid conflicts with the trucks and the personal vehicles. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. And when we get back from our break, we want to talk a little bit about the transportation system specifically geared toward the movement of freight and global trade. Please join us after the break, and we'll continue our discussion.
International business, huh? Number 1, know the culture of that country. Come alive with Pepsi. Translated into Chinese is, Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the dead. PepsiCo made that mistake in Taiwan. Learn about strategic planning, government policy, and policy analysis, and so much more. You can become a part of this exciting career field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Hello, and welcome back to Trade Talks. I'm Tom O'Brien with the Center for International Trade and Transportation at California State University, Long Beach. And my guest today is Dr. Jen Giuliano with the Saul Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California. And as we discussed, the director of the MetTrans Transportation Center. And Jen, before the break, we were talking about transportation systems in general, which is a big topic. We want to spend a little bit of time now talking about global trade and the systems that support that. This is Trade Talks after all. So let me ask an overarching question to start with. Why is trade global in nature now?
Oh my goodness, that's a long, I'll have to give you a very long answer. It actually goes fundamentally to two things. One is constantly declining transportation costs, and the other is information technology. So that in the case of declining transportation costs, I can then substitute transportation for other things, and I can therefore look for the cheapest inputs that I can find in a given manufactured product. And so we have seen the move to lower wage countries because labor is such a huge part of production, okay? Secondly, on the information technology side, it's the technology that actually allows for a distributed production system to actually operate, because there's enough now fast exchange of information to be able to manage a decentralized production. So those are really the two big things.
And I assume that over time, the way we move goods has also become a lot more efficient in terms of design, technology.
Yes, well, as you know, the first sort of revolution was the container revolution all the way back in the 1960s, and that really changed things because you could ship things and they could be secure, and you didn't have to have people loading ships and unloading ships one package at a time and all those things. So that was, of course, very revolutionary. And then from there, one of the big things was scale economies in shipping. And because it was so much easier and cheaper to move containers around, it made it possible to create larger and larger ships. And so we've seen a consistent increase in the size of a ship over time in terms of containers. Until now, they're many times larger than they were way back in the 1960s. That alone has changed all kinds of other things because we are dealing with very giant lots of goods rather than smaller lots. That means we need giant places to unload these ships. It means that we need huge networks to distribute them. There's all kinds of ancillary side effects of these very large ships. We also have seen changes on the consumer side, and I should say particularly on the retailing side. So we have seen over this period of time the increase in the size of retail operations from the mom and pop store to the big boxes. So we've seen this larger and larger scale retailing, which feeds right into larger and larger scale shipping.
You raise a good point, though, that this is still a relatively recent phenomenon, that containerization, is only as new as the 1950s and really the 1960s. And so over the past 20 years, we must have seen a significant change in the way we move goods, the size of the vessels and changes in retail.
We've seen really big things in the last 20 years. First of all, we've seen the establishment of China as our biggest importer, and that has given the Pacific Coast a huge advantage and has led to the tremendous growth, particularly of the Southern California ports. At the same time, we've gotten way better at handling goods on the docks themselves. We have better information, which allows us to do the logistics of containers way better than we ever had before. We have double stack trains, which allows us to get goods moving in higher volumes than we ever had before. So there are many different pieces of efficiency that have come along. More recently, we are more focused on operational efficiency. So we've seen the introduction of appointment systems. We've seen the introduction of information systems that allow you to predict better which container is going to be picked up when. And lots of things like that to try to increase the throughput on the land side.
Is there anything that hasn't changed? Is there a part of the industry that still sort of moves goods the way it always had, or is this really a cross-cutting across all segments of?
I'm going to say it's pretty much across the board because there's also been concentration in the logistics industry itself. So, we have logistics providers that may own warehouses that may be a subsidiary of a terminal or a liner shipping company. We have all sorts of connections in terms of who owns what, and there's been actually a concentration of actors over a period of time.
It sounds like a lot of groups and individuals to coordinate in moving goods.
Yes, indeed. And we often talk about the efficiency of the supply chain, and we often talk about how each element in the supply chain by itself is quite efficient. So the railroads are very efficient in and of themselves, and warehousing is very efficient in and of itself, and terminals are pretty efficient all by themselves. But the links between those operations are not efficient because everybody is doing what's best for them, not what's best necessarily for the entire supply chain. And that's really where the problems are and what we're seeing.
You're telling an interesting story about sort of changes in in operations and facilitated by technology and larger vessels. Has the infrastructure kept up with those changes over these past 20 years?
Interestingly, I would say on the port side it actually has. There have been major improvements in ports all over the world, actually. The ability to service larger and larger vehicles has been developed. More sophisticated ways of tracking cargo have been developed, so all kinds of things have actually happened to make, I think, the port infrastructure improved, right? That's not the story on the land side. The railroads have disinvested in mileage since deregulation. So that's from the 1980s up until very recently. And so they are pretty much at capacity in terms of their existing infrastructure. They are hesitant to invest more in infrastructure. It's a very expensive thing. And they are often seeking government assistance to actually do that.
And that's an interesting part of all of this, is who pays for the infrastructure
Yes.
that moves goods, because it's a different story in some cases than what we see on the public transit side, for example.
Oh, it's absolutely different. As I said earlier, ports may or may not be subsidized. And I pointed out that in California, we don't subsidize our ports. Therefore, the investments are coming from the revenues that the ports themselves are receiving. And so it's a pay as kind of, you pay for, you build what you can pay for. In other places, notably Virginia, notably Savannah, the port, notably Florida, ports are being subsidized. The state is actually putting up the money to make the port improvements as a way, again, of trying to generate economic development and trying to capture trade from other ports at this point.
Why these different approaches, do you think, from place to place?
I think that, first of all, those who don't have a strong port see it as a revenue generator in the future, and they feel that, in order to be a major player on the global map, they need to have a very important port of call. They do feel, especially in places that have had lower wages, that have had high unemployment rates and so on, it's a way to try to generate jobs. There's the idea that a port actually generates a lot of indirect economic impact. So those are some of the reasons that I see as motivations.
And we've talked about a number of different modes here. And of course, the last mile, as my trucker friends will remind me, is serviced by the truck. Have we
Yes.
seen significant changes in how that last mile is served and how trucking has changed over time?
Well, trucking is a really interesting industry because it is so fractured. There's the full load operators that are generally big companies that do the interstate trade. There's the less than truckload operators that tend to be independent operators that do interstate but also local trade. There's the drayage section of the trucking industry.
And that's a term worth explaining,
Oh,
drayage.
okay. These are the trucks that actually serve the trade at the ports.
Okay.
They pick up and drop off goods from the ports. And then there's the the package delivery companies. So these are all different segments of a really big industry. The package delivery segment is probably as efficient as you can get. They pay a lot to hire the best logistics experts in the nation or in the world to constantly refine their routing and operations to be as efficient as possible. So they are kind of at the lead of the pack. In contrast, the drayage companies and the LTL companies that tend to be
less than truckload, right?
Less than truckload, yes. Tend to be independent operators. They're working on very tiny margins. They're not making a lot of money. And they have a limited capacity to invest in technology. So they are sort of behind the curve in terms of efficiency.
And you talk about small package, it reminds me that in fact the global trade system is really integrated. It includes things like air transport as well. That's part of the supply chain, right?
Absolutely. We have, actually air freight is the fastest growing segment of the freight flow industry. It's growing faster than anything else. Trucking, by the way, has the largest total volume of the freight market and the largest by volume of the freight market. So it's actually overcome rail in terms of ton miles at this point.
And is the last mile principally the reason for that, or?
I think the reason for that is a couple of things. First of all, we're moving to higher value products overall. So the share of heavy products like coal or corn as a proportion of all freight is shrinking. And the proportion of electronics and consumer goods is increasing. Those are higher value products. They demand faster deliveries and therefore are going to the faster modes. So that's what explains trucking, and that's what actually explains air freight as well.
You mentioned the ascendancy of China as a manufacturing center over the past 20 years, and that positioned the U.S. pretty well from a global trade competitiveness point of view, particularly the west coast of the U.S., our proximity to China. But really now we're seeing markets grow across the world. So I guess my question is, can we remain complacent or assume that our position as a global trade leader in the U.S. is safe for the time being?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it's the shifts in trade that are going on and will continue to go on, both because of the rising per capita income in developing countries. So, for example, South American countries have been enjoying, on average, good increases in per capita income. They are larger consumers, so therefore more trade is going to go in that direction than previously. China's wages are going up. They are becoming less competitive in the low wage sector, and they also want to move on to higher value production anyway. So some of the low wage production is moving to Southeast Asia. That then changes shipping lines and shipping channels or shipping routes. So all of this could have a big impact on the West Coast. At the same, we know this because for the past 5 years, the West Coast actually has been losing market share, both to the east and south, and to North America as a whole.
So some of our Canadian and Mexican counterparts
is gaining market share on the West Coast.
You mentioned the potential for changes in trade routes as well. 5-10 years ago, there was a lot of expectations about what an expanded Panama Canal might mean to trade. Do you think it's had the impact that people anticipated?
I don't think it's had much impact, mainly because as modern as the new canal is, it isn't. The size of ships have outrun the new Panama Canal. So the largest ships cannot go through the Panama Canal. So the really big volume shipping is going to continue to go some other route other than the Panama Canal. I think it's had an effect on smaller vessels and smaller shipping, and I think it has drawn at least some market to the south of the United States.
The Texas,
Yeah,
the Gulf
Gulf.
the Gulf Coast. What about the potential impact, as you mentioned, the rising wages in Asia? Are we seeing shifts in manufacturing and trade going further west in Asia? And is the Suez Canal a potential alternative that we have to think about?
Yes, I would say it very much is because of where things are going. And if we look even further out, you have to expect that Africa will be the next producing area. And that again will give you a different geography for how we're going to ship things, and it will favor actually the East Coast rather than the West Coast.
Is there a potential for increased exports with these new markets? Is that something that can keep us competitive?
Absolutely. And remember also that we keep talking about goods, but most of world trade is actually service and money. And so we're already an exporter of service and money. And I think that's actually what's going to happen, that we will increase our ability to export high-level services, financial services, and so on, right? And we'll be probably importing less because of automation and manufacturing that makes it actually cheaper to operate here.
So how does that work with these larger vessels that are shipping goods around the world if demand decreases?
Well, you probably know that the shipping industry is not doing well at the present time. It's got an excess supply of ships on its hands. It's been trying to survive by consolidation, and we now have, is it 3 or 4 major consortia? Alliances. And we've seen some really major players go bankrupt, like the Korean player. So the industry is trying to concentrate, trying to drive out others by low prices in sort of a classic competition that in economics we call an oligopolistic competition. That means there's very few players and they're all trying to break each other by lowering prices so low that they can't afford to operate. So they try to get the weak person out so that they can consolidate more. And then the end goal, of course, is to raise prices. So how all of that's going to play out, who knows? But on the other hand, we have very large concentrations of population in places, right? And so just looking at the millions of people that live along the East Coast or the millions on the West Coast, there's always going to be a market for some amount of high volume shipping.
And how much of that is driven by the rise of e-commerce and the demand for increasing home delivery for a variety of goods, including fresh produce and everything now?
Well, that actually, the revolution there, I would say, is on the last mile side more than on the liner shipping side. The thing that it does is it makes very rapid delivery really important at the last mile. Okay, so what we're seeing big changes in warehousing and distribution in metropolitan areas, because if you're going to promise 2-hour delivery, then you have to be within 2 hours of who you're promising. And in a congested metropolitan area, it's not so easy to be 2 hours from everybody. So we're actually seeing rising demand for warehousing and distribution, fulfillment centers, right, within urban areas rather than at the edges of urban areas. And so things are kind of changing from this longer term dispersion that we had seen with the emergence of very large operations at the outskirts of metropolitan areas. Now, some of that, yes, is going to national markets. Some of it is going back to fulfillment centers so that it can be near the customer.
And I imagine that's creating tensions between the people who plan our cities. The redevelopment of our urban cores has been an exciting thing that's happened over the past 20 years. But not a lot of those plans include warehousing and distribution as sort of the ideal way that a city functions.
Yes, not a lot of those plans think about deliveries at all. Many cities don't have a plan that would say we need to have a certain amount of loading facilities on site rather than off site, because there's not enough street space to be able to accommodate all of this increasing stuff. Building developers are actually responding. For example, apartment houses today are built with internal systems for package delivery. So the builders get it.
Mini sorting centers.
Yes, mini sorting centers. The builders get it, but land is very valuable in the cores of cities, and no builder is going to give away some of that land to a loading facility if the city doesn't tell them they need to do that. So internally they're solving their problem, but externally they're not solving their problem.
And that's a particular challenge as we get more restaurants in these places.
Absolutely.
Just as we want to eliminate those trucks, we're creating an increased demand for them.
Yes, we definitely are seeing a huge increase in demand for local deliveries everywhere.
We started the episode this time talking about one of the changes you saw or observed in transportation systems over time in general is the impact of environmental awareness. Are we seeing the same thing in the freight sector when it comes to the way we move goods and the priorities?
Oh yes, we are. We're seeing it in many different ways. Some of it is what we call eco-efficiencies, searching for eco-efficiencies. And what that means is, can we do something that will save energy, reduce pollution, but at the same time also save money? So you have seen it, for example, in packaging. Your detergent is way more concentrated than it ever was before, and it comes in a smaller bottle. That's a way of shrinking the packaging so that you are using less plastic and less cardboard and less a lot of other things. So that's one example. Another example is the experimentation with alternative fuel vehicles. So UPS, FedEx, the major delivery services, all are experimenting with electric vehicles, with hybrid vehicles, and so on, to try to reduce the amount of carbon emissions that are associated with those services. We are seeing efforts by the ports here in Southern California, very ambitious efforts to achieve zero emission operations by 2035, which means electrifying to allow ships to use electricity while they're in dock instead of their diesel engines. So there's been a great deal of activity at all levels. On the government side, the action has been in Europe, if we talk about last mile. We have many examples in Europe of so-called low emission zones where only trucks that meet certain requirements can enter the downtown area, and everybody else cannot, at least during certain times. We have government subsidized consolidation centers so that delivery services actually can have a local distribution center, which would be prohibitively costly for them to do on their own because for a number of reasons, but the public sector actually subsidizes that to make it happen.
It's fascinating, and the the rapid changes in this industry are fascinating to watch. As we close, I'm going to ask you to put your look into the crystal ball again, right? Put on your prognosticator's hat. Tell me what 20 years from now the movement of goods will look like. Will it be on Hyperloop systems, or will everything be printed by 3Ds? What do you expect?
I think a lot of things will be printed by 3D, but not as much as we might think. I think that some form of automated delivery will happen. I'm not sure what. I'm not sure I think Hyperloop as an infrastructure is way too expensive to actually be the answer. It's going to be more likely to use the existing infrastructure because it's going to be cheaper that way. But I'm going to say some sort of automation. And, we're already experimenting with robots to do the last foot to deliver to your door and things like that. Who knows where drones are going to go? I don't think that'll be a big deal in cities, but it might be a big deal outside of cities. And I think probably more importantly is how people will be ordering those goods and the time and the way that they'll be delivered. So you can do right now on your cell phone all kinds of things. Well, your cell phone, pretty soon your refrigerator will be able to do the same thing, right? And so you're not going to have to order. All you do is tell your refrigerator your preferences, right? And your refrigerator is going to order your food, and it's going to come to your door, and the robot is going to know how to open your door and put the food in your refrigerator. So we're not, we have to think more about how this delivery is going to happen given the technology changes that are happening.
Well, I think that's a good point to end it on. The future looks interesting if
Yes, it does.
nothing else. Well, Jen, thank you for being our guest on Trade Talks. It's been a fascinating discussion, and we'll have you back in the near future to see how good your predictions are.
Well, thank you.
This has been Trade Talks. I'm Tom O'Brien. Thank you for joining us, and please come back the next time we're around the negotiating table.